Here again with Coffee and Conversation, I'm Shashank Bengali, your host, and Seth Schoen from the Electronic Frontier Foundation is joining me to talk about privacy and public health during the pandemic.
Thank you, Shashank. It's wonderful to be here.
Clearly, people have a lot of concerns about how this data collected during the pandemic is going to be used, but I still think it seems kind of a human failing in a way that we don't think twice about this sort of data protection when we are using our smartphones to do any number of things. But when it comes to a pandemic, we do kind of reflexively question how much we're giving up. Now, is that because we instinctively trust our governments in many cases less? Is it because of protections that social media companies and others put around how they use the data? Privacy standards, hardware standards, decentralized data, all these things that we've come to expect from the Facebooks and Googles of the world. We don't necessarily trust governments to do that. So how much of it is just the government's not really being in this business all the time, and how much of it is the fact that we need to have a different level of trust with our government than we do with our social media apps?
One point might just be that a person's infection with COVID, notwithstanding that it is a transmissible disease that can also pose a risk to other people, is really otherwise firmly in the category of what we would understand as medical data, as a medical diagnosis. And that's some of the kinds of data that people have routinely thought of as very, very sensitive, that they would usually be very reluctant to share publicly or to share with someone other than a doctor or a family member. And often with really good reason. We heard stories from some parts of the world about people really being physically threatened and intimidated if people around them thought that they might have been exposed, sort of like people saying, keep away from me or keep away from us, and really have a very strong reaction. So I think those are all ways in which this sort of data really is medical data and really can be pretty sensitive and pretty consequential. I think another is that people will point out, well, governments can put you in jail, and generally businesses can't. And so businesses may actually be behaving in ways that are very intrusive and very consequential for your life, but they don't ultimately have this power to physically restrain you and detain you and punish you. And the state does have that power. That's a way in which it makes sense to really hold the state to high standards of transparency and have a lot of scrutiny over how the state uses its power. It can be a power of life and death over people, and it can be a power to imprison, power to really control aspects of people's lives, which is not to say that the power that businesses have is inconsequential.
Certainly, the power to imprison, the power to press criminal charges is different from what Facebook can do. But that is a great segue into another question I wanted to ask, which is now we've seen this huge surge in protests around the world, beginning with the protests for racial justice in the United States, spreading to so many countries in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I wonder if EFF can talk us through a little bit about what the impact is of data sharing across racial and ethnic minority groups. Obviously, there is a huge interest for people who are protesting against state policies and state practices to want to protect their privacy in certain cases. How does that work in a case where you've got mass protests at the same time as a mass pandemic?
We often would mention protesters as a group of people who may have reason to be concerned about their location and about letting their whereabouts be known. And I think that's really commonly true. We'll talk about journalists meeting with sources. So if you were to go out and interview a confidential source, then you also have another kind of location privacy concern. I think there are concerns that have been raised about whether law enforcement agencies in some jurisdictions tried to use information that was collected for pandemic control in order to identify protesters or in order to try to intimidate or discourage protesters. A lot of the same technologies that, for example, we were talking about South Korea, that the government has officially, according to published legislation, in my understanding, again, enacted after the SARS outbreak, that they have the power to make the mobile carriers turn over information about people's whereabouts on the basis of their phones. And that's something that our organization has been concerned about for a long time in the US, because the legal status of that information in the US remains much more unsettled than we would like. It's such a versatile source of data for revealing really very sensitive things about people. So we'd like to see it have a high level of legal protection. We know that as a technological matter, the same kind of techniques that, for example, the government in South Korea used to study these dynamics of the spread of COVID-19 can also be used to tell who was present in a place at a particular time, assuming that people are carrying smartphones, which certainly most people are doing most of the time in the developed world today.
It's all the time we have for this episode of Coffee and Conversation. I'm Shashank Bengali. Please join us next time.